You know how protest movements can feel like these temporary flashes in the pan? Well, today we're going to dig into a really powerful argument that the government's reaction to Occupy Wall Street over a decade ago wasn't just about clearing out some parks. It was actually about building something permanent, an architecture of control that's still on the table, ready to be used today.
So here's the central idea from the source material we're looking at. The legal powers, the policing tactics, and the surveillance tech that were all brought together to handle the Occupy movement, well, they weren't just a one-time thing. Instead, they created this, durable, reusable architecture of control, something that any future administration could just pick up and use for completely different reasons. All right, so how did this whole thing get built? We're going to kick things off with the catalyst, the Occupy movement itself. Then we'll look at the three main pillars: the power that's written down on paper, the tactics for controlling physical space, and of course, the surveillance technology that watches over it all. And then we'll see how all these pieces lock together to create this completed blueprint for control. Okay, let's dive right in. The event that, according to this analysis, really set all of this in motion, the Occupy Wall Street movement back in 2011. It wasn't just the protests themselves that mattered, it was the government's response, which basically became a live-fire laboratory for developing and cementing the very powers we're about to break down. So first up, let's talk about the legal pillar of this architecture. Right at the height of the Occupy protests, this huge defense spending bill gets passed, the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act. You'll hear it called the NDAA. And tucked away inside was a little provision that for the very first time wrote the authority for indefinite military detention right into U.S. law. And the real key to this new power? It comes down to just two words: associated forces. See, the law said you could detain anyone supporting al-Qaeda or the Taliban, but then it added this phrase, associated forces, and just left it totally undefined. And boom, that created this giant legal loophole. It basically gave the executive branch a blank check to define who the enemy is long after the original 9/11 attacks. Now, at the time, President Obama seemed to put the brakes on this. When he actually signed the bill, he put out a statement saying, "Look, my administration won't use this power against American citizens." Sounds pretty clear, right? A solid protection. Well, this is where we get to the absolute crucial distinction. That signing statement, it's basically just a policy memo. It's a promise from one administration. It's not the law. But the law, the statute itself, that's permanent. So by signing that bill, the power became permanent law, while the promise not to use it was just a memo. It's now on the books, a tool waiting for any future president.
So what happened when people challenged this? Well, a group of journalists and activists sued, and at first they actually won. A district court agreed with them and blocked the whole thing. But that victory, it didn't last long. An appeals court came in and overturned the ruling. And get this, not because they disagreed on the substance, but on a technicality. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, who just declined to hear it. And that was it. The debate was over. The law stayed on the books, fully intact, like a loaded weapon just sitting there in the executive branch's arsenal.
Okay, let's move on to the second pillar and see how this thing gets built. We're talking about controlling physical space. And the source here argues that the authorities didn't just, contain the Occupy movement. They rolled out a brand new, much more aggressive strategy to physically take it apart. The source has a name for this: strategic incapacitation. Basically, the whole goal shifted. It wasn't about cordoning off protesters in some free speech zone anymore. The new goal was to actively dismantle the movement itself, to break it, to just grind it down, break its momentum, and make it physically exhausting for people to even show up.
And a perfect example of this in action is a tactic called kettling. Here's how it works. Police use these movable barriers, even netting, to completely surround and trap a group of protesters. And just like that, a public street becomes an inescapable cage. It's brutally effective. It doesn't just stop a march, it makes mass arrests almost easy.
And the sheer scale, this was, wow. It was staggering. I mean, in one of the most famous examples of this whole strategy, over 700 peaceful marchers were arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge in a single day. Think about that. This wasn't just clearing a street. This was sending a powerful, chilling message to anyone else who might be thinking about joining in.
All right, that brings us to our third and final pillar, technology. Because the response to Occupy wasn't just about boots on the ground. It was about this new combination of federal surveillance, military-grade tech, and, this is a big one, corporate partnership.
Yeah, this wasn't just the government acting alone. Not even close. Documents that came out later, through Freedom of Information Act requests, they revealed this coordinated, nationwide campaign. It was the FBI, Homeland Security, and, wait for it, corporate partners. The New York Stock Exchange, major Wall Street banks, they were all in the loop. What you have here is this weird public-private fusion, where law enforcement basically becomes the private security force for the very corporations that people were protesting against.
And the tech they rolled out, it was serious. We're not talking about a few beat cops with radios. This was a full-on, high-tech operation. You've got centralized CCTV networks in Lower Manhattan watching everything, mobile surveillance towers, called Skywatch towers, literally looming over public parks. Undercover officers were everywhere, even infiltrating meetings in church sanctuaries. They even had military-grade sonic cannons, these LRAs for crowd control. Basically, that entire massive security machine that was built after 9/11, it was being turned inward and aimed squarely at a domestic political movement.
Okay, so now let's put all the pieces together. How do these three pillars, the legal power, the control of physical space, and all that technology, how do they lock together to form what the source is calling a completed architecture of control?
The whole argument is that this toolkit was, in a way, designed to be repurposed. Remember that super vague term, associated forces, from that defense bill? Well, the source lays out a scenario. All a future administration has to do is issue a new legal memo. They could decide that some domestic protest group is an associated force of a foreign enemy, and just like that, they've got the legal justification to use this entire powerful toolkit against them.
The source has a great term for this. They call it the ratchet effect of executive power. You know how a ratchet wrench works, right? It clicks forward, tightens things, but it can't go backwards. Well, that's the idea here. First, a crisis happens, and that makes these expanded powers seem normal. Second, those powers get written into permanent law. And third, every leader after that inherits this bigger, more powerful toolkit. The ratchet of state power just keeps clicking forward. It almost never clicks back.
And this quote from the source it ties it all together perfectly. It's saying there's a direct line from the kettling on the streets of New York to these bigger questions we have today about deploying federal power in American cities. It's not a broken line. It's a direct and pretty chilling lineage of expanding state power.
So, in the end, this analysis doesn't really give us a neat and tidy answer. Instead, it leaves us with a challenge, a really important one. It leaves us with this powerful question. Once this kind of architecture of control is built and state power expands, does it ever really shrink back? And that's a question that's more relevant than ever as these tools become a permanent part of the landscape.